Welcome to our panel on Erich Fromm, Sex and Gender. My name is Javier Sefnitz. I'm a co-organizer of the conference. I'm an anarchist, a healthcare provider, and the author of the forthcoming Queer Tolstoy, a psychobiography. As moderator, please allow me to explain how the panel will work, introduce the speakers in order of appearance, and provide some introductory comments of my own. So first, please note that this meeting is being recorded. Please use the chat feature to introduce yourself. To ask a question, if you would like us to read it out for you, please use the question and answer function. If you would like to address the panel directly with a comment or question, please use the raise your hand function and we will unmute you. Both of these options can be found in the Zoom settings indicated by more and an ellipsis. Now for our panelists. Petteri Pietikainen is professor of the history of sciences and ideas at the University of Oulu, Finland. His major publications in English include The Alchemists of Human Nature, Psychological Utopianism in Gross, Jung, Reich, and Fromm, Neurosis and Modernity, The Age of Nervousness in Sweden, and Madness, a History. Scott Remmer is an author and freelance writer who has been published in Counterpunch, In These Times, Africa is a Country, Common Dreams, Open Democracy, the LA Review of Books, Roar Magazine, and International Affairs. He received his MPhil in Political Thought and Intellectual History from Cambridge University, where he specialized in Erich Fromm's theory of hope and utopia. He currently has a book on American democratic socialism under peer review with SUNY Press. Lynn Chancer is professor of sociology at Hunter College and the executive officer of the PhD program in sociology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She is the author of numerous books, including Sadomasochism in Everyday Life, Dynamics of Power and Powerlessness, High-Profile Crimes, When Legal Cases Become Social Causes, and of an edited volume with John Andrews entitled The Unhappy Divorce of Sociology and Psychoanalysis. She has also written numerous articles about Erich Fromm and feminist theory. Now for my comments. Arguably, aspects of both Freudian and Frommian psychosocioanalysis are important for understanding gender and sexuality. Attachments from infancy and early childhood and in adolescence and adulthood are crucial for the development of human personality. In other words, sexual satisfaction and existential meaning are important for well-being. On the one hand, Lynn Chancer, one of our speakers, has argued that a pre-Oedipal or early developmental concern with relatedness underpins Erich Fromm's humanistic psychology. On the other, authoritarian leftists like to call anarchists and left communists infantile. Still, in contrast to Fromm, whose theories tend toward a desexualized psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud claimed that humans are innately bisexual in terms of orientation and non-binary in terms of gender. That's besides his prescriptive recommendations, which we can talk about later. The evolutionary biologist Charles Darwin agreed that every man, quote, and woman is hermaphrodite, end quote. According to Freud, Eros is the preserver of all things, and we have what he calls a polymorphously perverse disposition from birth. As one of the divine patrons of homoeroticism in classical Greece and the presumptive life force, Eros extends sexual sensibility, quote, anatomically beyond the regions of the body designed for genital union, and tends to involve all sensations emanating from it, end quote, by Freud. This subversiveness of Eros was as equally feared by Plato in the Republic, who banned poets from his utopia due to its disruptive potential, as it was welcomed by the anarchist psychiatrist Otto, champion of the sexual revolution, and the critical theorist Herbert Marcuse, author of Eros and Civilization. Perhaps it was Eros that inspired numerous feminists and lesbians to play a leading role in Ireland's 1916 Easter Rising against British rule. As described by our panelist Petteri Pietikainen, Gross saw this life force as superseding the patriarchal will to power and stimulating the egalitarian will to relatedness. For the psycho-utopian Gross, Eros refers to the combination of innate morality and innate sexuality that recalls the hypothesized memory of ancestral matriarchal communism. As such, Eros is, and I quote Pietikainen, an anarchistic destabilizer of the bourgeois order, a troublemaker, and a destroyer of social control. Arrayed against Thanatos, otherwise known as the death drive, Eros upholds the will to live by ensuring love, union, libidinal satisfaction, and survival. That being said, we cannot ignore that psychoanalytic practice considered homosexuality a mental illness for much of the 20th century. To an extent, this may reflect the marginalization of Gross's radical approach, which appears to have been LGBT-friendly, thanks in part perhaps to his friendship with the sexologist and gay activist Magnus Hirschfeld, who invented the term transgender. Although Freud disagreed with and fought against the psychiatric classification of same-sex attraction, it is undeniable that his theory is heteronormative and transphobic, and that his treatment of erotic inversion as an aberration may have legitimized the subsequent psychological abuse of the LGBT community. Similar criticism could be made of Fromm's view of the so-called homosexual deviation and his endorsement of the gender binary. Ironically enough, in spite of this theorist's reliance on homoerotic and genderqueer sources. A principled stance against heterosexist oppression is especially relevant now when considering the scourge of so-called conversion therapy persisting to this day, and the hateful "don't say gay" laws being passed in numerous Republican-controlled states. As our panelist Scott Remmer will explain, Trumpism, authoritarianism, and sadomasochism are closely related. It is striking in this sense to contemplate just how closely the US far-right's promotion of traditional values has been influenced and borrowed from Vladimir Putin's reactionary regime, which banned homosexual propaganda in 2013, decriminalized domestic violence in 2018, and now carries out horrifying war crimes in Syria and Ukraine. On this panel, we will discuss Fromm and Gross's theories of the Mutterrecht, or the hypothesized universality of matriarchal societies in ancient history before the imposition of patriarchal oppression, Frommian views on dating, misogyny, inceldom, and the psychosexual dimensions of right-wing authoritarianism, and the paradox whereby Fromm's theories contain strong feminist and humanist sentiments, yet have not resonated in contemporary feminism. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to present, followed by an internal discussion, and then Q&A with the audience. So thank you, and Petteri, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. I will show you some slides. And I will discuss the idea of Mutterrecht, as Javier just told you. And he already sort of introduced Otto Gross, who may not be that familiar to you compared to Erich Fromm. But let me just share my screen now. Wait a second. I get the message that host disabled participant screen sharing.
One moment here. Let's see if we can change that on the fly.
Okay. Now. All right.
Perfect. We can see it. You may, yeah, great, into slideshow. Awesome. Looks good.
Excellent. All right. Okay. So I'm Petteri from the University of Oulu, the professor of history of sciences and ideas, and I have written a book in which I studied the psycho-utopian ideas of four people, and Erich Fromm is one of them, and Otto Gross is another. And the specific idea I will talk about is the Mutterrecht, and Javier already mentioned Otto Gross, who's a fascinating figure. He was contemporary to C.G. Jung, And in fact, he was Jung's patient at the Burghölzli mental hospital in 1908 because of drug addiction. And he was also an early disciple of Sigmund Freud. And he was a psychoanalyst, psychiatrist, and he worked for a while at the famous psychiatric clinic headed by psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin in Munich. But he became more interested in politics, and especially anarchism and art, than in establishing an academic career. He was long forgotten, but during the past 2-3 decades, there has been increased interest in Otto Gross, and there's now an Otto Gross Society, and which organizes conferences, and these are images of some of the conference proceedings. And I have myself attended one of these conferences, Utopia and Eros. But he was very interested in the idea of mother right, and so was Erich Fromm in his in his early career. And the third Freudian, who was also even fascinated by the idea of mother right, or the idea of matriarchal past of Europe, was Wilhelm Reich. So all these three were more or less enamored of the idea of mother right. And what does that mean? I will shortly explain it to you. The idea of the mother right was really introduced by a Swiss private scholar, Bachhofen, who published a book called Das Mutterrecht, Mother Right, in 1861. And in that book, this Swiss scholar claimed that woman was the source of first civilization, not the man, but the woman. And some decades later, when Friedrich Engels was organizing Marx's writings and manuscripts, he came upon this idea of the mother right. And he also, Engels was also heavily influenced himself by the anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan and his studies on Native Americans who were living in the state of New York in the mid-1900s. And Engels wrote a book partly based on Marx's writings, which is called in English The Origins of the Family, Der Ursprung der Familie, which came out in 1884 in German edition. And that book had a very it influenced both socialists and communists and anarchists, and another group that was sort of infatuated by the idea of the mother right or matriarchy was the nationalists and so-called Völkisch authors and thinkers in Germany. So we could say that both the right-wing and the left-wing authors were like influenced by the idea of the mother right. And one of these thinkers who was influenced by the idea was Otto Gross, as I already mentioned. And the most remarkable thesis in the Bachhofen's book Das Mutterrecht is that the present patriarchal organization of the family, especially in Europe, was preceded by a matriarchal family that had been prevalent in ancient times in Greece and Asia Minor and in the Mediterranean area. And this idea, as I mentioned, was very influential in Europe. And Otto Gross was one of them who saw matriarchy as a historical period when really women enjoyed economic and thereby also sexual independence from men. Gross was very critical towards what he regarded as the father right. His own father was a famous criminologist and called Hans Gross, who to his son's eyes represented the bourgeois society, repressive society, and sort of anti-human society, which also represses like this healthy instincts of humans. And to Gross, matriarchy really represented the golden age and the paradise of the primordial time. And Gross, like many others, was also influenced by the idea that was also put forward by Bachofen, namely that even before the era of matriarchy, there was a period of good-natured sexual anarchy, promiscuity. When in the words of Bachofen, the only bond between creatures was that of Aphroditean desire. So it was an era of free love in Bachofen's mind. And that was what really fascinated Otto Gross, who was really a preacher of free love and experimenter in sexual freedom. And not long after Otto Gross presented his ideas of matriarchy, another radical thinker and socialist, Erich Fromm, wrote about matriarchy and the idea of the mother right, and very much like Otto Gross, Fromm also contended that if we suppress the society of the father right, the patriarchal authoritarian society and the family, if these institutions were abolished, it would be a major step towards human emancipation. And this is a direct quote from Fromm's writing in 1934. And there he compares the patriarchal society and patriarchal family with the matriarchal society and matriarchal family. And he really attributes the negative characteristics of contemporary capitalist bourgeois society to this patriarchal society and family. Whereas the matriarchal family, or how Fromm himself called it, the matricentric complex, was characterized by a feeling of optimistic trust in mother's unconditional love, far fewer guilt feelings, far fewer superego, and a greater capacity for pleasure and happiness. Along with these traits, there also develops the ideal of motherly compassion and love for the weak and others in need of help. So we can see here the binary categories, or Fromm's fascination with the binary categories and his inclination to use these binary categories, or especially in his later writings when he moved to the States. And this particular article was written in 1934, when I think he was still living in Germany at the time, but he moved to the States later in the 1930s. And he also argued in 1934 that the working class has represented the matricentric tendencies in Western societies. And he saw a connection between socialism and these matricentric ideas. And in his view, this connection explained why so many socialist authors had sympathized with the theory of matriarchy. That was in idea 1934. But later in his life, he talked about the matriarchal societies in the 1960s. But then his attitude towards this idea had become more negative, and he gave sarcastic comments on rival leftist intellectuals, especially Herbert Marcuse, was very popular among the radical youth in the 1960s. But Fromm thought that Marcuse and some other left-wing intellectuals were misguided advocates of neo-matriarchy. So he changed his mind to some extent, and I think he ceased to believe in the idea that there even had been a matriarchal society that had preceded the prevailing patriarchal social order and the bourgeois social order. And as a conclusion, about the function of matriarchy for Gross and Fromm, if I had more time, I could also have included Wilhelm Reich. As I mentioned, Reich was also interested in the idea of matriarchy, and especially when he was a so-called Freudo-Marxist himself, that is from the late 1920s to late 1930s. But whereas Groth attributed virtually all that was fake, distorted, and sick to the patriarchal fatherhood, of which he himself was a victim, or he considered himself a victim of the fatherhood and the social order that was to him symbolized by his own father, the criminologist Hans Gross. And then again, as a utopian, I would say, he saw that there has been a sort of primordial paradise, and that we could even return to that primordial era if we just return to the matriarchal society and with this egalitarian spirit. So that was one of the main ingredients of Otto Gross' psychological utopianism, the destruction of the patriarchal family and patriarchal social order, and a return to the paradise of matriarch. And Fromm had similar ideas in the 1930s. They were more like, they were not as utopian, I would say, more moderate, but he identified matriarchy with the socialist working class and also Marxist social program. But a few decades later, he became critical towards what he called infantile regression to matriarchalism. And he criticized what he saw as the hedonistic hippie lifestyle of the 1960s and the culture of Beatles. So he thought that the so-called radicals of the 1960s were more or less hedonistic. They really didn't know much about Marx or other classics. What they were looking instead was sort of instant gratification. They were not really serious about what they were like preaching. And of course, Marcuse was his own like bête noire, a rival. That was one reason he didn't like too much of what Marcuse was saying and writing. Okay, 15 minutes is up. And it's time for me to conclude. This is the book in which I discuss all these psycho-utopians I have talked about in this short presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Petteri. I can very much highly recommend this book as well. So just as Joe has been indicating in the chat, do keep your questions in mind for the Q&A session. We're going to have a half hour afterwards, after the initial presentations for that purpose. So over to Scott.
Okay, well, first I just want to thank everyone for having me. I'm really glad to be here. Erich Fromm's 1956 book, The Art of Loving, offers observations relevant even to contemporary politics. Today, I'd like to discuss how Fromm's insights help us to understand the way that love, sex, and gender underpin some of our most vexing contemporary political and social problems, specifically malaise under neoliberalism, incel culture, and authoritarian movements. Recapitulating Fromm's view of the human condition will help us begin. Our existential quandary is that we are wrenched from paradisiacal primal unity into a state of separation. From the transcendent oneness we experience as fetuses, cocooned by the shelter of the womb, we are forced to individuate. To achieve a well-adjusted life and create a sustainable civilization, we must resolve this wrenching division constructively. We will never recuperate unconditional motherly love or the bliss of infancy. Nonetheless, we must rediscover aspects of that prelapsarian unity through love, work, and life-affirming economic and political systems which reverse the alienation we experience from our nature and from labor. As Fromm understands it, love, which he defines as, quote, an action, the practice of a human power, end quote, that requires care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge, the active concern for the life and growth of that which we love, is the full answer to the problem of existence. Love allows us to achieve unity, even as we preserve our individual integrity. Conversely, a lack of love can lead to dangerous outcomes. The angst which arises from existential disunity is so strong that people are impelled to escape from freedom, as Fromm famously termed it. If we seek pseudo-solutions in herd conformity or in consumer comforts which render us passive and inert, we risk spiritual suffocation. Non-authoritarian attempts to escape from freedom can be destructive if unsuccessful. Fromm opined in 1956 that the incidence of alcoholism, drug addiction, compulsive sexualism, and suicide in contemporary Western society are symptoms of this relative failure of herd conformity, end quote. But if we seek an escape from freedom in the form of authoritarians who stoke and satisfy sadistic, destructive drives, we court literal death as well. Now that we've established this theoretical foundation, we can address some contemporary applications. Kristen Goadsey, a pananthropologist, recently published a book entitled Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. Fromm would likely agree with the premise. He observed that both good sex and the nurturance of new life each require giving, just as maintaining friendships, relationships, and well-being requires giving. As Fromm wrote, quote, not he who has much is rich, but he who gives much. The hoarder who is anxiously worried about losing something is, psychologically speaking, the poor, impoverished man, regardless of how much he has. Whoever is capable of giving of himself is rich, end quote. Capitalism encourages us to adopt the hoarder's mentality. Its structures of life, from individual apartments to unfulfilling underpaid jobs in a competitive economic system, engender loneliness and convert us into, quote, alienated automatons, unquote, who seek pleasure and fulfillment in commodities. This is not good for love. As Fromm writes, quote, automatons cannot love. They can exchange their personality packages and hope for a fair bargain, end quote. Capitalism also molds character so that people seek efficiency, speed, and profit. But the mentality of instant gratification stoked by dating apps and capitalism is antithetical to the spirit of relationality, care, knowledge, responsibility, and respect that Fromm argues is necessary for love. The rhythms, mentality, and aims of economic life diffuse into private life. Anticipating contemporary sociology on neoliberalism, Fromm observes that modern man experiences his life energy as an investment with which he should make the highest profit, considering his position and the situation on the personality market, end quote. Since most people spend their days at what anthropologist David Graeber called bullshit jobs, performing highly disciplined, alienated labor, when they are liberated from the workplace, they react against the work world's unpleasant rigors by engaging in passive, untaxing leisure activities. But since love and friendship require patience, effort, and undivided attention, shortcuts ironically end up stymieing us. As Fromm wrote, modern man thinks he loses something, time, when he does not do things quickly. Yet he does not know what to do with the time he gains, except kill it. All of this helps explain the epidemic of loneliness and generalized malaise, dissatisfaction, and burnout throughout the West. Some modern attitudes towards sex treat it as a shortcut to anxiety relief or happiness. Fromm acknowledged that orgiastic states could temporarily solve the problem of separation, but he thought that rather than causing emotional intimacy, satisfying sex was a result of emotional intimacy and trust. He observed that pursuing sex as a royal road to happiness can backfire, writing that, quote, the obvious clinical facts demonstrate that men and women who devote their lives to unrestricted sexual satisfaction do not attain happiness and very often suffer from severe neurotic conflicts or symptoms, end quote. He also noted that the sex drive isn't necessarily life-affirming, commenting that sexual desire can be stimulated by the anxiety of aloneness, by the wish to conquer or to be conquered, by vanity, by the wish to hurt, and even to destroy, end quote. Such observations help explain the pathology of incel culture. Incels, a shortening of involuntary celibate, are members of an internet community centered around being sexually rejected. From the temporary and universally relatable experience of romantic and sexual failure, incels catastrophize, constructing an entire persona and identity predicated upon their supposed worthlessness. Many incels are straight men. They often exhibit extreme sadistic misogyny and homophobia. A number of them have gone on mass shooting sprees. Fromm writes that if the masculine character traits of a man are weakened because emotionally he has remained a child, he will try to compensate for this lack by the exclusive emphasis on his male role and sex. The result is the Don Juan, who needs to prove his male prowess and sex because he is unsure of his masculinity in a characterological sense. When the paralysis of masculinity is more extreme, sadism, the use of force, becomes the main, a perverted substitute for masculinity, end quote. Fromm's observation about sexually obsessed men applies equally well to incels, since they too structure their psyches around sex, albeit its absence, not its presence. Fromm would not be surprised that incels' self-flagellating masochism, their wallowing in sexual failure, is coupled with sadistic misogyny and homophobia. Nor would it shock him, I think, that trans rights inspire such ferocious blowback from the far right. Fromm believed that people only realize themselves when they integrate their feminine and masculine sides. Incels' very failure to attain emotional maturity or self-assured masculinity leads them to elevate sex and conventional masculinity to supreme values. Incels' demonization of women, femininity, and LGBTQ people is a coping strategy, a sublimation of their difficulties achieving confident masculinity, and a reaction formation against a desire for women that has been frustrated. This defense mechanism prevents incels from embracing their feminine aspects and attaining the integrated state which characterizes psychologically healthy adulthood. This misogynistic, homophobic, and transphobic reaction formation extends well beyond the incel community, which is relatively small. It is endemic on the conservative right, as innumerable Republican sex scandals and exposés of closeted homophobic politicians have demonstrated. It may likewise explain the authoritarian right's startlingly intense animus against masks, which represent, in their view, weakness and femininity. Though far-right authoritarian movements are a response to economic hardship and political upheaval, they are also products of sublimated longings. Fromm's thesis in Escape from Freedom is that authoritarian movements are ultimately erotic. They derive their intensity from a twisted yearning for love and recognition, a natural craving that has been perverted for a love that will transcend the rootlessness and loneliness of modern mass capitalist society. The relationship between the authoritarian leader and their followers conforms to a dialectic of sadism and masochism. Fromm notes that Hitler, quote, despised and loved the German masses in the typically sadistic manner, comparing them to a submissive woman. This behavior bears a marked similarity to Trump's ambivalent relationship with his adoring supporters. On the one hand, Trump assures them of his love and craves their adulation. He told them, quote, I'm in love and you're in love. We're all in love together at the 2019 CPAC convention. He affirmed to participants in the January 6th putsch that, quote, we love you, you're very special, end quote. And he obsesses over crowd sizes and whether he enjoys universal popularity. But on the other hand, Trump also mocks his Christian supporters as marks for evangelical hustlers and as ridiculed his supporters generally. Upon witnessing adoring fans chasing his limo, he said, quote, look at these people. It's literally a little bit sad, end quote. And he has referred to his fans as, quote, these disgusting people, end quote. As dominators, authoritarian leaders are sociopathic and grasping. This selfishness makes them incapable of receiving the love that they seek. Fromm's observations are illuminating in this regard. He writes that, quote, the selfish person does not love himself too much, but too little. In fact, he hates himself. This lack of fondness and care for himself, which is only one expression of his lack of productiveness, leaves him empty and frustrated. He is necessarily unhappy and anxiously concerned to snatch from life the satisfactions which he blocks himself from attaining. Fromm goes on to note that, quote, the selfish person is interested only in himself, wants everything for himself, feels no pleasure in giving, but only in taking. He can see nothing but himself. He judges everything and everyone from its usefulness to him. He is basically unable to love, end quote. Such descriptions of the perpetual motion of a person imprisoned by their own sociopathic tendencies seem to fit Trump to a T. Fromm contrasts motherly love, unconditional and forgiving, with fatherly love, which is conditional and operates on the logic that, quote, I love you because you fulfill my expectations, because you do your duty, you are like me. Authoritarians offer their supporters fatherly love, yet, as Fromm observes, in the nature of fatherly love lies the fact that obedience becomes the main virtue, that disobedience is the main sin, and its punishment the withdrawal of fatherly love, end quote. The simulacrum of love which authoritarian demagogues bestow on their followers is conditional, revocable at any moment. This makes it unstable and subconsciously unsatisfying. The shadow of uncertainty shrouding the authoritarian leader's fatherly love is authoritarian followers' incentive to deepen their commitment so that they can prove their continued worth. Some commentators observing the incel community's potential for violence have suggested that we should investigate solutions which address inequality of access to sex. And the legalization of safe, non-exploitative sex work may be a promising release valve for sexually frustrated people of all genders, although it is unlikely to successfully address many incels' misogyny. But Fromm's insight is that incels' focus on sex is merely a symptom, a sublimation. The problem runs far deeper. The incels' quest for sex is really a quest to transcend existential loneliness, just as authoritarian movements are, among true believers who aren't motivated by economic self-interest, a doomed search for love and acceptance. Incels and the authoritarian masses haven't given up on love altogether, though. They simply seek it in the wrong places. Fromm wrote that, quote, to analyze the nature of love is to discover its general absence today and to criticize the social conditions responsible for its absence, end quote. A contemporary left politics which neutralizes the authoritarian menace would be a politics of love. It would give brotherhood, which Fromm defined as love directed towards one's fellow people, pride of place. It would critique our society's lovelessness and fight for the political, economic, and social structures necessary to realize true solidarity, an egalitarian economy, an end to alienated labor and rigid gender roles, and an ethic of care, community, and mutual responsibility. Whether the left can successfully champion such a politics of love is no idle question. As January 6th so disturbingly illustrated, the fate of our democracy rests in the balance. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott. That was a great presentation. And now to our last speaker, Lynn.
Yeah, hi, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, so thank you very much for organizing the entire day in this panel, and I very much appreciated Pettery's and Scott's presence, which I thought were excellent and sort of closely attuned, I hope, with what I'm about to say. And I wanted to start by saying that these are kind of informal and exploratory reflections on some ideas. So what I wanted to say by way of introduction is this presentation is on why Fromm and feminist theory, but as my, I guess, central analytic question this morning or this afternoon is, why hasn't feminist theory in fact become better known, better embraced than it has been. So I've written before, as Javier nicely mentioned in the introduction, on Fromm and feminism, and have would argue again, and what Scott just said, I think, gives even much more verification of that, that Fromm's ideas were more consonant than is frequently perceived with contemporary interests in feminist theory and queer theory, et cetera. So if you compare the reception of, say, Foucault or Fanon with Fromm in terms of how important they're seen as inspiration for ongoing theorizing in the worlds and important worlds of gender and sexuality, Fromm, I think, as Neil McLaughlin has talked about Fromm as a forgotten intellectual, he's certainly also, I think, a forgotten feminist intellectual. And so, and that association isn't made that often. But I've argued in my work that some of the ideas that make for the potential compatibility, even if it's been taken seriously, is Fromm's emphasis on mutual recognition, going back to the art of loving, very much the kind of thing that Jessica Benjamin would talked about in The Bonds of Love, coming out of Frankfurt School emphases, and also Fromm's understanding of dominance and subordination relationships, the sadomasochistic dynamics. Even more, Scott's whole presentation, I think, was about other ways that Fromm's ideas, and so was Petteri, about gender and sexuality should make him a more well-known figure and more accepted. But the rest of my presentation, short presentation, exploration of some ideas, is why not? Why is there not more of an association between Fromm and feminism, despite a potential relevance, and what could be done? What kinds of arguments might bring Fromm into more contemporary notice, and why does even that matter? So, you know, I was noticing when I was sitting and listening to the other presentations that I think the Zoom is up to 71, and I actually counted how many women were on the Zoom, or you know, what it looked like. I mean, you can't tell from names, but it used to be that often you wouldn't see, it would be kind of male dominated, any kind of Fromm gathering. I think that's changed a little bit. You know, it looked somewhat is in the process of changing, but it hasn't changed that much. Okay, so going back to this analytic question, how might one explain the lack of relevance and so one factor I would say has to do with a first factor with intellectual history, and 3 points in terms of intellectual concepts is that the first one would be that there's an absence of association of Fromm with critiques of power, the concept of power, and some of what Scott and Petteri were talking about. I think we didn't mention something that Neil McLaughlin called to my attention a while ago, which is that Fromm's analysis of the case of Dora, Freud's case of Dora, would make, I think, any radical feminist from early second wave feminism. It's a critique that is very, very much based on power, and yet, you know, I teach that text, and I think know the literature around it pretty well. Freud's Dora, you don't come across Fromm's analysis very much. So it raises the question of, I think, intellectual associations, and Neil McLaughlin's new book on Fromm, which I recommend to everyone, is excellent. I think talks about the various factors in general intellectually, which has kept Fromm more forgotten than he should be. And what I'm saying is that the lack of knowledge of Dora is one of those, is a kind of subset of ideas about Fromm related to power, in fact, and power and the recognition of power being incredibly important to contemporary feminist theorizing of all kinds, is something that needs to be circulated more, needs to be made much more well known. Intellectual, this is the first factor in intellectual history. A second factor is association between Fromm, obviously, and Freud and psychoanalysis, which points to the larger question, certainly still in US academia, of what John Andrews and 18 other people wrote about in the Unhappy Divorce book of Sociology and Psychoanalysis, that sociology, unfortunately, is social sciences, even more than sociology, has not yet deeply accepted the importance. And I think there's a need for a Kuhnian style sort of revolution in our conceptual framework so that we take into account the whole individual, the unconscious, obviously, desires, and precisely the kinds of Freudian notions in ways that Fromm talked about. So it's part of that also. Third intellectual factor under this intellectual history point, I think, has to do, interestingly, with the concept of matriarchy, because that concept of matriarchy and some of what was started to be discussed, interestingly, I read the chat also about matriarchy and patriarchy. The concept of matriarchy in much feminist theory has been associated with biological determinism and essentialism. And that concept, I think, would not help make Fromm's connection with potentially wonderful and useful notions of feminist theory more prominent. So I think those factors are part, and how one can answer those factors would be a first part of what one would have to change in terms of past intellectual history and future intellectual circulation of ideas about and related to Fromm, and Fromm's arguably ongoing and maybe increased more than ever relevance. So a second factor, after talking about the intellectual history, would be contemporary theoretical relevance, and that relevance as not being perceived in contemporary feminist thought as much as it should be. And so here I would go back to an early radical feminist concept, another discussion about radical feminism, perhaps itself not having a good name. I think Fromm was very, very interestingly related in that Dora critique, and what I'm about to say now, had certain notions that are socialist feminists and certain notions that are radical feminist. And the early radical feminist concept of the personal as political is one that I think could be far more associated with Fromm and coming out of Scott's presentation, The Art of Loving, so as to create what one could even call, a la Kieran Durkin, a feminist humanism. So what is the personal as political? It certainly is an emphasis on how our personal psychic and our political social lives are intimately, incredibly interconnected, and all the many consequences realization. So how we act toward others is constantly prefigurative of how we want the world to be, and part of the importance, as Stanley Aronowitz and Ellen Willis used to say, he was my advisor, of the importance of maintaining some kind of utopian vision, not being pragmatic about those visions, which is something I think is also true, but still having utopian visions. So Fromm's emphasis in The Art of Loving, that is so consonant with mutual recognition, so important for feminism, and with that early concept of the personal as political, I think is potentially reinvigorating and inspirational for social movements generally, especially right now at a time of right wing, but arguably even consciously left authoritarianism, when we're seeing Stalinism on the rise. So obviously, I'm glad people are mentioning the Ukraine, because the importance of how people in social movements treat each other so as not to counterproductively and divisively and not particularly helpfully divide and antagonize each other, and possibly displace anger and resentments onto people close to one another, is perhaps highly indicative, maybe more than ever, of the need for remembering the personal as political, remembering that how we treat each other in day-to-day life, and of course in social movements, is incredibly important. The third factor of perhaps why Fromm has not been recognized as a more important figure for with resonance in contemporary feminist terms of gender and, as Scott points out, sexualities as well, is to ask the question of where Fromm fits into current gigantic, I think, sweeping and apt emphases on intersectionality. That is, Fromm seen for the purposes of contemporary feminism and feminisms, which, if has, I think, hugely taken intersectionality to its important core and applied it constantly. Is Fromm arguably an intersectional figure? I think in terms of class, he certainly was. It's very, very obvious about putting together Fromm's socialism and Fromm's ideas about psychic relationships, about mutual recognition. I think the class emphasis is very, very important. As some of you on the Zoom know, revisiting a paper I wrote some time ago on guaranteed income, the concept of guaranteed income, which Fromm was an early proponent of in political terms. And obviously, so he, an intersectional, as an intersectional thinker, certainly class was there. But someone else brought up, I think maybe it was Peter in a previous session, what about race? What did Fromm have to say about race? And here, there's always a tendency, I think, to go back to thinkers who were in a different time period when, they were not necessarily explicitly thinking as much as they could, should, they weren't about race, and ask, well, is there relevant? Fromm's ideas about in Escape from Freedom, about dominance and subordination, about escape mechanisms, helps to tackle, again, a la intersectional concerns, the question of why racism, why biases, not just that we have biases, but why biases are so incredibly persistent. And the rise of, I think, in Fromm's concept of sadomasochism, the need for defense mechanisms, as was mentioned, of displacing anger and resentment onto people close by, onto groups close by, is part of sadomasochistic dynamics. In my own work, so indebted to Fromm on sadomasochism in everyday life, I argue that we are constantly, in terms of understanding complex social stratifications, people constantly find themselves both powerless and powerful. That stratification, I've elsewhere, my ABC diagram, that people are constantly in a position of both power and powerlessness. And that is some way of using some of Fromm's ideas and emphasis on the complexity of escape mechanisms and sadomasochism to understand how we reproduce social stratification in complex, non-reducible ways concerning gender, race, class, sexuality, the concerns of the LGBTQ movement, et cetera. Okay, fourth and finally, and this is my last point, so as I know discussion here is going to be very, very important, is to go toward conclusion in terms of how and why Fromm's ideas have not been taken as seriously as they could and should be within feminist theory, is to raise the question of, I guess I would say, of paradoxes, of complexity and paradoxes. I was going to put it that how can one potentially, in feminist and personalist political terms, be at once a Frommian and going beyond Frommianism, if you want to call it that, because clearly one, I think in feminist terms, being an anything, a Foucaultian, a Frommian, a Bourdieuian, any cult of the individual is highly problematic. At the same time, or heroizing any one figure. At the same time, of course, people are influenced by major figures in all kinds of psychic and political ways. But the question of paradox, of how we can be simultaneously in complex ways understanding multiple dimensions, I think right there, Fromm is incredibly important. More specifically, how do we balance individual, the level of the agency, and all the aspects of non-reducible imagination that are so unique to particular people, with simultaneously the need for connection that some of you have been talking about. Art of Loving is very much about the paradox that to love oneself and to love others is not contradictory, even though it seems it. How our autonomy and the need for autonomy and the need for connectedness, again, arguably or possibly seen as paradoxical, how do they come together? And so it seems to me, I guess what I'm arguing in conclusion is that Fromm's theoretical framework is at once a political and social movement framework. We can embrace seemingly contradictory dimensions at once. We don't have to see those as contradictory. We can think in terms of nuanced approaches to society, to politics, to social movements, because we all need both autonomy and connectedness, both independence and dependence, both perhaps people who are influential in our lives and going beyond that to a balance between those influences and our own strength and ability is a biophiliac notion to manage with influences and without influences. So by way of conclusion, what I'd like to say is that it's important to keep perhaps developing something we could call a feminist humanism, of pointing out how the relevance of Frommian ideas, particularly in terms of how we treat each other in social movements, in interrelationships, and the complexity of our intellectual frameworks is a very, very important task toward the future. Thank you.
So much, Lynn, really appreciate it. Thanks to you and all the other panelists. What I propose to do right now is have a brief internal discussion before we take questions from the audience, and I can see that there are a few. And so I want to start with Petteri. Petteri, and if you could please limit your comments to approximately a minute so that we can get to Q&A and have about a half hour. Petteri, I did want to ask you, thank you so much for tracing the common interest that Gross and Fromm had in Das Mutterrecht, the theory of motherhood and maternal communism. So why do you think that Fromm changed his view from the 1930s and 1970s?
I don't know how much he followed historical scholarship, but I would say that around the mid-20th century, most scholars had rejected the idea that there had been a matriarchal society in Europe or Asia Minor. Or there might be some other reasons of which I'm really not aware, because when I wrote about this idea and its appeal to these thinkers, and read these the publications and so forth, the archival material of these thinkers, I didn't really, as far as I remember, it was so many years ago, I didn't see any explicit reason in Fromm's writings where he would have given his reasons for rejecting the myth of matriarchy. I'm not sure about it, but it might have something to do with his observations in the US in the 1960s, when he saw that the youth and the radical youth was really not on the same wavelength as Fromm was. I think that they were not, the Fromm was thinking that these people are not really that serious about what they are saying. And they are not that well read or well versed in the classic writings of Marxism, socialism, and even psychoanalysis. Instead, they cling to a lifestyle that was like strange, unfamiliar to Fromm, who was an older gentleman by the 1960s. And he really didn't sympathize too much with the culture of the Beatles or the Doors and the hippie lifestyle. That might be one of the reasons that he connected this hedonistic lifestyle with the myth of matriarchy. But that's a speculation, really.
Sure. Thank you. I can also speculate. You noticed, you did note that his idea about the working class having matricentric tendencies that came out in a study from 1934, around the same time of his study of the attitudes of the German working class, which was a great, that study, a very innovative study, but also a very disappointing study in many ways, showing that many of the workers, while they may have professed interest in socialism, had in fact very authoritarian attitudes in reality. Okay, if I could, sorry, if I can move to Scott. Scott, I wanted to thank you so much for your analysis of gender and sexuality from a Frommian lens. I wanted to just comment briefly on your comment about, what could possibly, how could we possibly resolve this issue of inceldom, and your idea that, there might be sex workers for frustrated, sexually frustrated individuals did bring to mind to me Charles Fourier, his ideas of the Felon Stairs. I don't know if you're familiar with that, the idea of kind of free love in these communal experiments. And I think it had something to do also with Wilhelm Reich, as Petteri spoke, mentioned it briefly in passing. Reich kind of had this idea that the revolution presupposed liberation of sexuality, a sexual revolution. So in many ways, he appropriated Gross's ideas and used them for his own end. So I was wondering if you could comment briefly about whether you see any differences between Reich, or I don't know if you're familiar with Reich, but the idea that Reich had about sexual liberation versus Fromm's idea, as you I think eloquently described, of integrating intimacy and sexuality.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll confess I'm not tremendously familiar with Reich, but what I would say is that I think at least Fromm's insight is that the sexual need and the sexual drive is both biological and socially conditioned. And so, I think that he would sort of critique the idea of free love as being some sort of panacea, as not fully grappling with the ways in which our sexual desires are themselves conditioned by our political, economic, and social circumstances, and also by childhood conditioning, and just general social acclimatization. And so I think that I'm not sure that he and I'm not sure that I am necessarily opposed to the idea, but I think that the concept needs to be fully nuanced. In other words, simply sort of advocating for a legalization of sex work without trying to deal with some of the psychological foundations of some of our problems, the reason that there's so much misogyny, and all of these kind of more deep-seated issues of sexual dysfunction in American society, it might not end up being as successful as one might hope. I guess that would be what I would say. So understanding that kind of political law, new law or new regulation or whatever also has all sorts of social and psychological ramifications as well that need to be dealt with dialectically, I think would be what I would say.
Absolutely, thanks, Scott. And that brings to mind also Marcuse's concept of de-repressive sublimation, in the sense that there might be a relaxation or liberalization of sexual attitudes and behavior, but if that doesn't actually serve for emancipatory social or political ends, it might just end up reifying the system that exists.
Right, it could just reinforce it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, if I could, Lynn, just briefly ask you if you could just explain a little bit about Freud's case on Dora and Fromm's analysis of it. If you could just share that briefly for the audience.
Sure. Dora case study in hysteria. I'm not remembering off the top of my head the year that it was published, but it was someone who Dora was sent to Freud because she was in this, the young woman supposedly had hysteria. So like we're the time where that hysteria concept was being used. And in fact, it seemed like when you read about the case and Freud describes it, there was all this stuff going on in the background where her father is like sort of patriarchal bourgeois society. There were affairs with her father was going on, and there was someone was trying to approach, someone had approached, a friend of the family had approached Dora to have sex. And the interpretation of Freud is that, she was afraid to have sex, various things that had to do with the Oedipal complex, et cetera. But when you read it from a sociological or social or feminist point of view, radical feminist point of view, it seems like she's being, used in a particular sort of social and historical context. And Fromm was much more aware of that kind of situation of power and much more sympathetic to, when I teach it, a reading that's easy to make of the case, that Dora herself was pushing back on Freud's analysis and was trying to argue with it and was trying, and eventually, it's fascinating, at the end of Dora, she leaves the analysis. So Freud, and at one point also Freud says something like, Dora wants to kiss me. And, which is like such a clear sense of Freud's own projections. And when I read Fromm, I was amazed because I think Fromm on Dora could be like, it's just like a radical feminist critique of Freud in that case. And I mean, it's actually amazing from a feminist point of view, how alive Fromm was to the power relations and how much more sympathetic to an interpretation of Dora has of being sort of put in a dominant subordinate position by her historical moment. Fromm got the political, the power, the historical, and I think was critical, very, very critical of Freud.
Excellent, thanks so much. That's very helpful. Okay, so now I'm going to read out the one of the questions, and then after that, we'll take questions live from those who have raised your hand. I see one hand raised. We'll get to you next, okay? So the question I'm going to read is for Petteri. It's from Daniel Burston. And Daniel says, Petteri, it dawns on me that you've leapt over an important development in Fromm's theory of matriarchy in the sane society, where Fromm indicates that both matricentric and patricentric can foster growth or regression, and later in The Art of Loving, that both motherly and fatherly love are essential to optimal human development. Also, I don't believe that Fromm ever repudiated the concept of matriarchy. Your thoughts?
You might very well be right about it. In my own book on utopianism, I really didn't focus on this particular idea. I only brought it up because it seemed to fit in well with their overall intellectual framework and the way they criticized what they saw as the bourgeois, capitalist, patriarchal society. I didn't delve too deeply at all into this idea, so I have no objections to your argument. But whether he did not become more critical, that might also be the case, but he seemed to be critical towards what he called neo-matriarchy. So maybe he differentiated between the matriarchy that he himself sort of supported and the neo-matriarchy that he associated with the 1960s this hippie generation, the hedonistic lifestyle. That's my guess.
All right, thank you. I wanted to ask Daniel if that was adequate, and if you wanted to make a response, I can take you off mute. Well, actually, looks like.
Mute, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, no, I think that's a fair response, Petter. I One point that you raised in your discussion, which I think is very important, maybe more important than you made it in your presentation, is the fact that Fromm's critique of what you call neo-matriarchy was also a critique of the anti-intellectualism and the complete rejection of tradition in the past. When I say tradition, I include the radical tradition and the socialist tradition, and the idea that you can sort of start everything from scratch and just forget about the past. It's kind of mishuga. It's kind of nuts. So Fromm was very, very conscious of his intellectual heritage, and had hoped for a more sympathetic response from younger people. Instead, they gravitated towards Herbert Marcuse, who wasn't as critical of their anti-intellectualism, of the hippies' anti-intellectualism, and also towards I forget his name. But anyway, thank you for your comments. Could I say one more thing while am I still unmuted?
Go ahead.
I would like to direct a comment to Lynn, if I may. You mentioned Fromm's analysis of a fragment of an analysis of a case of hysteria, which was published in 1905. The Freud's case history. I don't remember where Fromm's critique appears, but I do know that in 1967, R.D. Laing offered up a very similar critique of Freud's treatment or Freud's framing of the whole familial situation in Dora's family. He didn't use the term patriarchy specifically, but it's very clear what the power dynamics were. So I can share that stuff with you offline later if you'd like.
Thank you. That'd be great. Thank you.
All right. So thank you, Daniel. So we're going to go to the next raised hand, which is going to be James Block.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I would like to direct this comment initially to something that Lynn said, which I don't think was exactly the focus of your comment, but in a way it opens a doorway for me to think about Fromm. I'm speaking in the last panel, but one of the things of a day-long conference is some of the ideas get pushed back to the end. And I think this is something I think that you've opened up that I think is important at least to consider about Fromm during the course of the day, and that is the question of power. Because fully taking your thoughts about Fromm's analysis of Dora, what I find, it just all of a sudden flashed to me that what I find missing in Fromm is really a concept of power. That Fromm has an extraordinary sense of things that we ought to be: self-love, mutual recognition, non-performative, non-pseudo-self, fulfilling our wishes, emotional openness, democracy, connection, autonomy. But the question that's never posed by Fromm to me in a way that involves a new concept of power from the world, from the power dynamic that we have in the world today, is how. How do anything of these things even going to get started? And I'm trying to offer this as a way of not spending the day simply going through all of the ideas, the descriptive and heuristic ideas that Fromm had that we are all in love with. But the question is how? And that to me involves a sense of empowerment, a sense of human empowerment from the beginnings of human life that help people to evolve, become the things that he wanted us to become. So in the end, I'm left feeling that so much of this is both useful critically against people who don't act in the ways, and we're filled with that with Fromm, all the ways that people misuse their humanity, and all the ways they ought to use their humanity. But the question is, what is this humanity and how does it get generated in a way that produces a different world? Otherwise, I feel like at the end of the day, we're stuck where we started.
Mhm. That was addressed to me, James, right? Partially?
Jim, yeah, Jim, yeah. Yeah, sorry?
I'm sorry. I said James instead of Jim.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, so I hear what you're saying, and I don't think Fromm was writing, generally speaking, about power in the way that political theorists would, or Marxist theorists. I'm not sure that is particular strength, and I don't think that any one theorist has to be equally strong on everything, but I would say that concepts of power as presently in social theory and social movements, where of course understanding power is important, but sometimes discussions of power are very much siloed, if you will, from discussions of mutual recognition, of what Scott was saying, love, that there's still an arguably gendered division between how we think of power. So, I teach all these courses in feminism, and when I think of Kate Millett's early work, which many of you may know, which takes the concept of power and it revolutionizes it by saying that power exists across the spectrum, from intimate personal relations to the state. And perhaps we can use Fromm to encourage us to make that connection across the board, to not silo the concept of power on the one hand, right, nor go to the other extreme to talking about, the psychosocial in such a way that we forget the way political theorists talk about power. So I don't think it was Fromm's strength, but on the other hand, I think Fromm calls our attention to the fact that I think we too much think about power in ways that don't link the sort of psychic levels with the collective social structural. And both, I think, need to be, and again, the embracing paradoxes brought together.
One final thought on that. I mean, I appreciate that. I think if I got it, that you were agreeing with me, or we were agreeing together, really, because for me, the question becomes, I mean, exactly what you're saying. The question is to have of the things we want that Fromm talks to us about and helps us understand are important and central and transformative agendas. We need a concept of empowerment, not power, but empowerment, that links these things together in ways that I think feminism would be at the center of that. There'd be many new kinds of movements that would be at the center of that. They would be the constituents.
Yeah, I think, yeah, and I agree with you about empowerment. I think Fromm's very helpful with empowerment. And again, I'm where I am. I don't think Fromm it has to be everything and was not so much a political theorist. So I think I'm agreeing with that, except that I also just lately am reappreciating Fromm for being, my in-laws did a publication called New Politics, and Fromm was very much part of that, because Fromm was an early critic of Stalinism, when, Stalinism was being overlooked. And I mean, that certainly was understanding reflexively how power affects people who are progressive, not only people on the right, and sort of calling attention to unconscious uses of power. So I think one can, even if he's not the theorist, and in the Marxist tradition, I think there's unfortunately overall, including but going beyond Fromm, a lack of how do we strategize effectively? What does transformation at the level of state power look like in practical terms and also in humanistic terms?
Thank you.
Could I just jump in for a second? I just want to agree with what Lynn's saying. It seems to me that what Fromm is offering is the idea of relationality, and the notion that through sort of fulfilling human interpersonal relationships on a small level, you can generate the kinds of habits, the kinds of characterological traits that would enable you to build a movement, to transform a political space. So I do think that love and relationality kind of are that kind of empowerment that you're looking for. But I also think we can look at Fromm's biography. We can look at sort of what he was doing as a political actor. So he obviously was practicing as a psychoanalyst, on a small level, but then he was working for Eugene McCarthy and his presidential campaign. He was very active with the Socialist Party for decades. He donated tens of thousands of dollars to left-wing candidates. And he was going around giving speeches during presidential elections and things like that. So I think he in his own life was trying to perhaps provide a model or to do what he could as an intellectual, as a public intellectual, as a leftist, to embody the kinds of changes and the kinds of political strategies that he thought would be best in the American political moment. So I would just say we could look at his biography as well.
Sounds great. Thanks so much. So now we're going to move on to Gregory's question. I'm going to mute. Okay. There you go.
That works.
Go ahead.
Well,
I'm sorry.
can I be heard?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Scott. Because that's what I was thinking. If you look at his life, we get the model and we get the empowerment process. And even in his writing, he's addressing the issues of the day in a number of books right there. I mean, he's right. He even was on a interview with Mike Wallace you can go watch. So he's like a national, international character. And I think we model his patterns is what we do, right? We address the issues of today. We get as publicly out there as we possibly can. And that's what he did. So whatever his philosophy, however he thought, look at his life and you see his thoughts in action. So I think there's a congruence between his life and his work, and they informed each other, which is what I really like, experience thinking kind of process. And I see that in Fromm. So wasn't really a question. Sorry about that.
I totally agree. Yeah, no, that seems right. Am I allowed to ask a question?
Please.
So I guess this is both for Petteri and for Lynn, actually. So, both of you in differing ways kind of talk a bit about, either just kind of the way that we can interpret Fromm as feminist or, matriarchy. And so I was just kind of wondering, do we, what do we think about matriarchy as a political concept? Is it useful? Is it worth reviving? I know that David Graeber, who I had mentioned, right, came out with the theory of the dawn of everything, where he's talking about some contemporary archaeology that seems to suggest that in fact there sort of were matriarchal societies that existed prior to the establishment of sedentary agricultural ones. So I wonder, does that even matter? Do we, could it just be a myth, and could it still be politically relevant and useful? Does it need to be backed by archaeology? I just wonder if either of you have any thoughts.
Well, I don't know if you want to start, or do you want to go first?
Please go ahead, Lynn. Go ahead.
Thank you. Personally, I understand. I mean, it's funny because Fromm in using matriarchy. I don't know if some scholar on this call probably knows, did he go back to Bachofen, like as did Engels in The Origins of the State. Engels, interestingly, was using matriarchy also. And at least for me, I don't think theoretically in contemporary terms we need the concept of matriarchy. I do think it does smack of essentialism. And what I think, I think I wrote about this in one of my papers for Fromm. I understand what he was getting at. He was trying to have, find a basis for a sort of hopeful way of thinking about how human beings could be in the future. But from a feminist theoretical point of view, I think if, understanding the depth of gender, that gender is always involved, this, it's still unbelievably deeply embedded belief in this thing called masculinity and femininity, and we divide emotions and essentialize them. And I think the more radical, important part of Fromm on this issue is that human beings are non-essentialistically capable of the whole range of emotions, much more open and a complex polymorphous versions of sexualities, and that we don't need the concept of matriarchy to ground our belief in something different. We just have to begin to enact something different, and we don't have to go into, I think, a easily overly essentialized concept in order to do that. So I do think Engels was doing something similar for reasons that I understand why you make that move theoretically for political purposes, but I don't think it's necessary. And I think it can get you caught up in essentialistic thinking toward the future rather than it so-called wither away. That's my take.
Yeah, no, that totally agree.
Yes, there's not much that I need to add to Lynn's comment. Of course, myths can inspire us, irrespective of whether they can turn out to be true or not. And I happen to live in a place in Europe where women have relative equality, and in the neighboring country Sweden, the feminism is a civic religion, more or less. Any politician with her or his right mind would not say that I'm not a feminist.
Did you know how I can get a passport and get there?
I'm not sure whether the feminists or any politician in Sweden, the intellectuals have thought about the myth of matriarchy, whether it's true or not, but it's a political fight. But of course you need ideologies or intellectual frameworks in political struggles. And it seems to me that the feminists in Northern Europe, in Sweden, for example, have taken their cue from very many different authors. But I'm not sure whether Erich Fromm was one of them. Because when we look at what's happening in the Ukraine at the moment, I think the Fromm's ideas of matricentric complex do make sense. And there's so much warmongering going on now because of the Ukrainian war.
Yeah.
The more feminine voices, so to speak, they are now quite suppressed, at least in my country and Sweden, because we are now contemplating on, or not contemplating, but really applying for the NATO membership in 1 month's time, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very masculine. The discussion is now very, very masculine, quite military also.
Definitely.
There will be place for Fromm's art of loving,
Exactly.
not only in order to make the society more egalitarian, but to make it more peaceful. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lynn and Scott and Petteri. That's all the time that we have for our panel today. We appreciate it. We did record it. We will be publishing it shortly. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. All right. Thanks again. Okay. So next up, we're transitioning over to